Welcome to the IISS this afternoon. My name is Viraj Solanki. I am the research analyst for South Asia at the Institute. Our panelists flew in from the Sultanate of Oman yesterday, where the IISS, in partnership with the Near East and South Asia NESA Center of the U.S. National Defense University in Washington, D.C., organized the 13th edition of our annual joint IISS NESA Southern Asia Security Conference. This IISS NESA Track 1.5 Plus conference brought together senior government and security officials, along with uniquely top intelligence officials, as well as influential experts from the three core countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, as well as for the first time having participation from Sri Lanka and the Maldives. In view of the off-the-record nature of our Oman conference, today's discussion session will primarily be based on the speakers' individual interpretations and assessments of the discussions that took place on Southern Asian security. Dr. Roger Kangas on my left will focus on Afghanistan, followed by Jack Gill on US policy towards the region, Desmond Bowen on India-Pakistan relations, and Antoine Levesques on China in South Asia. Each of the speakers will make introductory remarks for 6 to 7 minutes to ensure we have a sufficient time for a useful discussion with you all. Our first speaker, Dr. Roger Kangas, is the Academic Dean at NESA and Professor of Central Asian Studies. Roger, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Viraj. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to discuss Afghanistan, at least as it was reviewed and assessed during our sessions, and obviously more than happy to further continue any questions afterwards. Two quick caveats to start. First, what I'm going to say really are my views and my interpretation of how I felt things went and not that of the U.S. government. And secondly, when discussing Afghanistan, I have to throw out the line, this is a critical year. I think we've said this for 18 years, that every year is a critical year. This one is. In part because we've had two issues happen, and I'll look really at those two plus a third, which are the wild cards, or what I would call elections, reconciliation, and tweets in the night. In terms of elections, first of all, it happened. And I think we need to pause for a moment and recognize the importance of that. They were twice postponed. There were doubts as to whether they would take place in terms of the security of the elections, but also the viability of them happening. Outside actors, including governments, were suggesting perhaps they be postponed in light of reconciliation efforts. And so what I would say, if we look at the elections, and these are, to be clear, the presidential elections, the positives. In terms of security, the Taliban declared war on the elections, specifically on the process, and were aiming to disrupt the actual carrying out of the electoral processes. There were attacks, there were challenges. The good news is they took place. People risked their lives and still voted, as a number of Afghan colleagues said. And again, this can't be sort of dismissed. This is a very significant act. And lastly, the process itself was Afghan managed. Private consultants and others were involved, private companies, et cetera. But this was not an election run by another government, as we could say, back in the last decade, this took place. Now, of course, there are negatives. There was a low turnout. The most optimistic assessment said that just under 1/3 of Afghan registered voters participated. Whether it was 2.8 million, 3 million, the numbers can vary. Others will say, well, realistically, 15% of the Afghan electorate turned out. And so if there is a winner of, say, 50% plus one, or just over 50%, if we don't need to go to a second round, what you're suggesting is 8% of the Afghan electorate is going to choose the president, which of course raises two quick concerns. One is really the notion of, can the winner be declared, and can they reach this threshold, and if not, will there be a delay in creating a second round, but also will there be legitimacy? There were efforts of course, to make sure that these elections were held in as free and fair conditions as possible, biometric voting efforts, et cetera. But no question that these negatives are going to have an impact on how those candidates who did not win the elections, if in fact the winner is declared either tomorrow or in the coming weeks, but also external actors. Now, was it wise to hold these? Well, in my honest opinion, yes. I think the legitimacy of the government would have actually declined further if they had not been held, because we would have been looking at some constitutional challenges. We've seen these in the past 18 years. They weren't the best, but obviously we can build on these results, and in future elections we should and could hope to see improvements. Again, this is a rather optimistic assessment, but I'd like to consider myself that. But the big challenge, as noted, is going to be the declaration of the winner. This, in part, sets the stage for the second element we have to look at, which is reconciliation. Very quickly, of course, we all know of the collapse of the efforts by Zalmay Khalilzad, the US-led efforts over the last year plus, sort of the close but failed. Interestingly, could these be restarted now that these elections may be over, or if they are over? In my opinion, I don't see why not. But we have a couple of quick challenges. First of all, the Taliban position. As much as they discuss what they view as a future state, they are still rather vague on a number of issues. It must be Islamic. What does that mean? They can speak in generalities in terms of what a future state will look like, but we're unclear as to what specifics are. What is power sharing? For the government, they look, of course, at a series of negotiations that have to happen, negotiations with NATO and the US, negotiations with the Taliban, negotiations with Pakistan specifically on the future of Afghanistan's domestic security, discussions with neighbors in the broader Islamic world, discussions with the West and international organizations about rebuilding Afghanistan, and discussions within the country about strengthening national institutions and addressing grievances at the local levels. All of these elements, in the minds of government officials, have to be brought up. The question is, in what sequence? And what level of intensity are we going to work with each of these? Believe it or not, these are still left unclear. The sequencing of these issues, do we put a ceasefire in first? Do we withdraw troops? Do we look at these efforts of decoupling the Taliban from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups? A lot of challenges, to include even specifics. What would be the role of women in this Islamic state that the Taliban declares? What does that look like? So no surprise, we're really adjusting to, if you want to call it, a leap of faith in the future of reconciliation efforts. And lastly, I would just say there are some wild card events in the next 6 months that we have to look at. And I don't at all mean to be cynical or catty about saying we have to worry about potential tweets. What I'm looking at is really rash decisions based on the U.S. electoral calendar. We saw this most recently with the sudden announcement of a departure of U.S. troops in Syria and the clear consequences this is having on the populations in northern Syria, and particularly the Kurdish community. Could we see the same in Afghanistan? There is a desire to remove U.S. troops, particularly before the next elections, or remove a significant number. What does that mean? And how does this create uncertainty about the U.S. role? What if there's a significant attack by ISIS or an ISIS affiliate? I've not mentioned them at all, but Islamic State is fast becoming a threat, not just in Afghanistan, but in the neighboring states. We have to look at this as a spoiler or actor in its own right today. And then finally, if there's a flare-up of violence in other parts of South Asia, could this literally and figuratively suck the oxygen out of the room, the attention drawn to Afghanistan, and really focus it elsewhere? Or could it create conditions where those actors may not want to engage in Afghanistan, thus setting the stage for ISIS and other groups to even further disrupt the situation in Afghanistan? A lot of these are tied together, and what I would say is potential disruption is perhaps the most important thing to look at in the next couple of months, which of course underscores the belief that this is a lively part of the arc of instability in the region. There's much more I could say, but I'll stop here. My colleagues will look at the neighboring states to see how these link together. So back to you, Viraj.
Thank you, Roger. Our second speaker is Jack Gill, who is an adjunct professor at NESA. Jack.
Thanks, Viraj, and thanks, Roger. Welcome, everyone. It's great to always be here at IISS with such good friends and scholars. Like Roger, I will speak in my personal capacity. I'm no longer employed full-time by the U.S. government, but I have an affiliation with the NESA Center going back a long time, but my remarks are my own. I'll take our conversation to the east and offer some observations on Pakistan and India from a personal/U.S. perspective. I'll start with Pakistan and make two broad points regarding the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. The first, to follow Dr. Kangas's remarks, Pakistan, of course, is intimately connected with Afghanistan in a symbiotic relationship, and the U.S. is endeavoring to work with the Prime Minister Imran Khan's government to achieve a peaceful, enduring solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. The U.S. Special Envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad, for example, expressed appreciation for Imran Khan's statement earlier this year that Pakistan would not be party to any internal conflict in Afghanistan anymore. Of course, we've heard such things from Pakistani leaders in the past, only to find them rather less than satisfactory. And Prime Minister Khan's statement at that time was necessitated by comments he had made in March and April that suggested that some interim body, not the elected Afghan government, should be in charge in Kabul, leading to stern rejoinders from the United States that the future of Afghanistan was for Afghans to decide. We are, of course, as Dr. Kangas indicated, in a hiatus at the moment, as far as the previous U.S. Taliban talks are concerned. Now, should these resume, the U.S. government is certain to expect strong and persistent efforts from Pakistan to push the Taliban towards A, a ceasefire, and B, to talks with the elected Afghan government, however the elections turn out, and with other Afghan stakeholders. As I alluded to by terming the Afghan-Pakistan relationship as symbiotic, an intra-Afghan dialogue aimed at peace is something the U.S. sees as in Pakistan's interest, especially for regional economic integration that would contribute to Prime Minister Khan's vision of Pakistan with a development-centric model. But again, we're in a wait-and-see moment for the time being. The second point on the United States and Pakistan relates to a key friction in the relationship, and that is Pakistani tolerance of, and in some cases support for, an array of terrorist groups. Secretary Pompeo has been very clear on this, as have other senior U.S. leaders. In fact, you'll find similar comments in every speech by every U.S. government official on this topic. And even though India altered the status of Kashmir within the Indian Union on 5 August this year, the message from the United States government has not changed, as Assistant Secretary Wells reiterated just a month ago on the margins of the UN General Assembly. In fact, this has been a very consistent message from the United States for the past 2 years since the release of the South Asia Strategy in August of 2017. In fact, you can find it in almost every statement by a representative of the U.S. government in the Obama administration as well. So this is not a new message to Pakistan. From the U.S. perspective, visible, irreversible action against such groups is in Pakistan's interest. Terror groups endanger Pakistan's internal stability, raise the likelihood of war with its neighbors, promote continued instability in Afghanistan, and inspire like-minded extremists across the region. And they reduce the appeal, of course, of Pakistan as a destination for investment and commerce. These considerations are above and beyond the menace such groups pose to the larger world, including the United States and our NATO allies. Action against them, visible, irreversible, I think is the phrase, the term of art being used most frequently, is thus in U.S. as well as Pakistan interest. Additionally, by perpetuating instability in Afghanistan, such groups make U.S. military withdrawal all the more difficult, even though this is the desired outcome of the U.S. government, the American people, and most regional actors. Let me shift over to India. The first point to make is the centrality of the Indian Ocean in this new U.S. Indo-Pacific policy, and therefore the centrality of India as a partner. It's evident in any number of statements from the U.S. National Security Strategy to Secretary Mattis's speech to the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, and to the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report from the Defense Department released this past June. This, of course, places a premium on U.S.-India relations. The emphasis on India, however, is also not new and predates the current administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. Indeed, there's considerable continuity between the current administration and its immediate predecessors. And you can trace a pretty consistent trajectory on U.S.-India relations from the latter part of the Clinton administration in the late 90s through George W. Bush to President Obama to the present day. Although U.S.-India ties are founded on key convergences, the second point to make is that the relationship is not without its divergences and frictions. Among these are differing views of Russia and Iran that could create challenges given the U.S. sanctions legislation that's in place vis-a-vis both of those states. Addressing China's role in the Indo-Pacific, and different definitions, geographically speaking, of what constitutes the Indo-Pacific region, since the US and India have different views on that. But perhaps the most serious at the moment are long-standing differences on trade and associated visa policies that have gained a lot of prominence in recent months. These are not insignificant by any means, but in my view, the convergences outweigh the divergences. Both governments are well aware of these as challenges, and both, I think, will seek to accommodate the differences in the interest of progress in the larger, and sustainability in the larger partnership. Let me conclude with a few words on the U.S. during the recent India-Pakistan crisis in February, and Washington's comments on the situation in Kashmir following the 5 August decision by the Indian government to change the state's status. As far as the crisis is concerned, we don't know a lot of details about the role of outsiders in resolution thereof. But Washington certainly played some kind of role, though it was less visible than has been in the past. Both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor spoke on the phone several times to their Indian and Pakistani counterparts, urging them to exercise restraint and avoid escalation. The U.S. also encouraged both to prioritize direct communication with one another and avoid further military activity. As noted above, communications with Islamabad also emphasized Pakistan taking meaningful action against terrorist groups operating on its soil. In the ensuing months, the U.S. government has continued to note that the world would benefit from reduced India-Pakistan tensions and a return to some kind of a bilateral dialogue between these two nuclear-armed states. As this will not be the last India-Pakistan crisis or confrontation, it's worth considering how to cope in the future, especially as it could be even more dangerous in the wake of events so far this year. One of those is the 5th August decision New Delhi took to alter the status of Jammu and Kashmir within the Indian Union and to impose very strict security lockdown in the region. Washington, both the executive and legislative branches, has been clear on its concerns about widespread detentions, including politicians and business leaders, and the enduring lockdown has placed strict restrictions on the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir on the Indian side. The U.S. government has made this known to the Indian government, including Prime Minister Modi, and it looks forward to a resumption of political engagement, elections, and the sort of development and economic improvements in the lives of ordinary Kashmiris that New Delhi has promised. The often volatile rhetoric between the two nuclear countries, India and Pakistan, since 5 August is also deeply troubling. A lowering of the tone and more moderation in the content would also, therefore, be most welcome from a U.S. government perspective. So with that, Chairman Viraj, I think my time is up. I'll turn it back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Jack. Our third speaker, Desmond Bowen, is an associate fellow in the South Asia program at the IISS. Desmond. Yes.
Thanks, Viraj. Faced with the topic of India-Pakistan relations, I felt that this might be a rather short intervention, and I think that may well still be the case. If international relations were judged by Eurovision standards, the current state of bilateral relations would rate 0 point. And while on this flight of fancy, it's also worth considering this relationship as compared with that of other mutually hostile neighbors with contiguous borders. Take North and South Korea, Venezuela and Colombia, Ukraine and Russia, just as examples. They all have, to some degree, political contacts, shared interests, commercial links, very varied perhaps, but there is something by way of a framework for cooperation or contact. The India-Pakistan relationship is thin to non-existent across the board. Now, my snapshot is of relations today. The historical baggage is well known to this audience. There is a sharp divergence between these two states. India seeks to both ignore and isolate Pakistan. Its communication to the wider world is that Pakistan must put its house in order to curb terrorist activity. Direct engagement with Pakistan is minimal. And a good example of this policy is the grey listing of Pakistan through the Financial Action Task Force, piece of machinery which is in operation this very week in terms of its plenary meeting. Pakistan's policy, on the other hand, is to implore the international community to put pressure on India, highlighting humanitarian abuses and politico-legal issues in respect of Kashmir. The speech of the Pakistani Prime Minister at UNGA in New York recently is a case in point. Pakistan seeks mediation, even internationalization, which India rejects utterly. The bad relations engendered by the Pulwama Balakot crises have deteriorated since the Indian government's decision of the 5th of August to incorporate Jammu and Kashmir into mainstream India. And it should be recognized that there is a good chance that the lessons drawn from that crisis by the two parties are at odds, thus feeding instability. Economic relations have been deliberately reduced to a low point, diplomatic relations have been downgraded, and the airspace for civil air transit is disrupted. At the same time, Kashmir has been described as a flashpoint, even a nuclear flashpoint by Pakistan, a view not shared by India, which speaks stridently of better times to come. The one glimmer of light is the technical negotiation over the Kartarpur corridor, which should enable Sikh veneration of the shrine, which is located across the border in Pakistan. Although this could have been imbued with political value, the negotiation, it seems, is strictly technical and humanitarian. So in the absence of a bilateral political framework, what contact is there? The routine weekly DGMO, the Director General of Military Operations, telephone link between the headquarters of the Pakistan and Indian military links, that link continues to exist, but seems not to have been activated over the attack at Pulwama and in the consequential action. At the time of the February crisis, ad hoc contact at senior level was made through intelligence channels, and I'd stress the word ad hoc. More generally, it should be recalled that the regional organization SARC, which might have provided a forum, has effectively been suspended. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has not so far been seen as a venue for contact. And the bilateral comprehensive, formerly composite dialogue, does not operate at present. At this conference of which Viraj spoke at the beginning, there was talk about the need for CBMs, confidence building measures, to improve the atmosphere. But that talk about CBMs does not identify a route for such progress, any more than the proposition that people-to-people contact should be advanced provides a pathway. So 2 comments on this bleak picture. It would be a good thing if there was proven machinery in place for communicating at the political level in a crisis. Such an arrangement would be enhanced if a back channel existed of trusted but probably deniable interlocutors. My second comment is that 2 sovereign states, not only sovereign states but nuclear armed states, should consider how better to manage their relationship for the long term, lest it deteriorate further. It is not just these 2 states which are affected by this non-relationship. Other regional actors, not least Afghanistan, are caught in the standoff. Thank you.
Thanks, Desmond. Our final speaker, Antoine Levesques, is the Research Fellow for South Asia at the IISS. Antoine.
Thank you, Viraj. Good afternoon. I will talk about China in South Asia. I must be selective, so I'll cover South Asia and US-China tensions, India-China, India and its response to China in the Indian Ocean, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So first, South Asia and US-China. South Asia is starting to lose strategic autonomy to US-China relations, and tensions particularly. The pressure to take sides rather than seeking advance, nuance and balance is becoming harder to resist for the entire region. In dealing with China as developing and unquestionably smaller economies, South Asian nations must all seek to maintain good relations with China to an extent, even India. In doing so, South Asian governments cannot anymore, without the US taking note, take those benefits only as they pertain to China the neighbor or China the development assistant partner, and leave those benefits which China draws for itself as a global power reshaping Asia's security order. Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US on the margins of the UNGA last month and his External Affairs Minister's noted visit to Washington set a new high watermark in India-US relations worth setting in the context I just described. China, for its part, is seeing
South Asia more than it did a year or so ago as a stake in its geopolitical contest with the US. Now, secondly, to India-China. India and China appear unable to build a positive new normal for themselves. This bilateral relationship is still in therapy following the 2017 Doklam face-off. Last week's informal summit in Chennai between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi was a success as it continued the top-level leadership engagement, free of a pressure to issue statements and other evidence of progress. But while the narrative last year emphasized the acceptability of openly agreeing to disagree on contentious issues and being sensitive to each other's concerns, this year the emphasis was rather more on the latter, all while discussion of Kashmir, chief amongst re-emerging points of vexation between the two countries, was reportedly avoided. So the relationship remains short enough on trust, low enough on internal fire breaks, and still unable to create new security institutions matching each other's growing mutually exclusive strategic ambitions. This raises fears for the stability of this crisis-prone relationship before the end of Mr. Modi's second term, including in the run-up to the G20 Leaders Summit, which India will be hosting in 2022. Let me now turn thirdly to India and its response to China in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean region remains in sharp focus for India in its near abroad, and this is much beyond India's unilateral focus on defense modernization and building a deterrence posture, a conventional one, I should say, against India in the Indian Ocean. New Delhi is busy realigning its political and economic diplomacy with countries in the Indian Ocean region, especially island states. The reported imminent publication of an unprecedented national security strategy could provide key insights into India's thinking in this regard, particularly how it defines today its role as a net security provider in the context of a now elevated Quad meeting of foreign ministers of Japan, US, Australia, and India. India's notion of the Indo-Pacific is diverse beyond military and security. This carries much as yet untapped potential. India has an ability to help island and littoral countries divide infrastructure projects to high quality, transparency, and sustainability standards, while India, as others, is unable to spend as much as China has on maritime Silk Road countries. India is keen to convince those countries to spend less overall and accept better collaborative infrastructure opportunities from itself and others. It wants to be in a position to take financing packages over the line in a manner perceived to be much likelier to preserve that country's national interest in the long run than going with China. India, like others, is showing signs of also being more responsive to island states' need for security assistance, which helps them tackle the non-traditional security threats they care about most, all while being relevant to traditional security concerns, China being foremost in mind here. Finally, to the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The CPEC can be confidently said to have withstood last year's unprecedented leadership transition in Pakistan. Politically, CPEC remains very much on the agenda and on track. Patchy information, however, suggests that practical implementation has not recovered to the pre-electoral momentum of 2017. Yet CPEC has never only been about practical projects. Last week's visit of Prime Minister Imran Khan to Beijing, accompanied by Pakistan's 10-year extended army chief, implied no diminution of China and Pakistan's respective commitments to each other on CPEC and beyond. I don't have time to cover that. In fact, the unprecedented reference to CPEC as a high-quality demonstrator of a Belt and Road Initiative, that's a quote, showed both countries are comfortable actually raising a little more still the profile of CPEC in the BRI. This focus on perceptions and expectations of CPEC within China's global ambitions for BRI is at odds with the origins of CPEC as an essentially bilateral project of projects. Yet the too big to fail label this confers on CPEC does not particularly favor one side over the other. Each side retains leverage and pressure over the other. Maintaining the security of CPEC is just as important to Pakistan as it is to China. Greater pressure on the BRI is likely in the next 6 months, as calls for its greater transparency will seek to mobilize unfavorable comparisons with standards under discussion at the G20 and even those underpinning the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. CPEC is likely to stand out more than before as both a symptom of what is perceived to be wrong with the BRI and as an opportunity to make trend-setting changes. In both cases, it will be important to remember how much CPEC is predicated on China and Pakistan's unique pre-existing security-led close partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. The floor is now open for the discussion session. Grateful if you could please identify yourself with your name and designation before you ask a question, and please could you keep your comments, questions short so that we can have as many people ask questions as possible. I'll begin with Dr. Hassan Al-Hassan from King's College London.
Thank you. Not a doctor yet, but hopefully soon. Gill, you touched on the US Indo-Pacific strategy and the premium that this places on India as a potentially strategic partner for the US. What is your sense on whether, from the US perspective, this partnership, does it extend to the Western Indian Ocean, by which I mean the Gulf and the Red Sea? Do you or anyone else on the panel know of any US efforts to involve India more closely in building the international coalition to secure the Gulf waters, especially against the backdrop of recent Iranian escalation? Has anything of the sort been discussed, perhaps during the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi and External Affairs Minister Jaishankar in Washington? Thank you.
Thanks, Hassan.
Do you want to take several, or do
Do you want to answer that?
Sure. The short answer is that the way the U.S. defines the Indo-Pacific is that it goes to the western coast of India. So it does not go as far as the Arabian Sea or the Gulf. So that's kind of the short, easy answer. And I'm not aware of any U.S. efforts to involve India directly in the security measures that are taken in and around the Arabian Sea and the Gulf. As you may be aware, there are several naval task forces that have been in existence for some years. India is not part of those. Pakistan is. NATO allies are. Other regional countries, but India is involved in there's a coordination mechanism because this navies all have to deconflict whether they're part of these task forces or not, and India does participate in those coordination mechanisms. But I'm not aware of any move further west.
Okay. And just a quick addition, one structural and one programmatic. Not only, as Jack noted, is there, I don't call it a bifurcation of responsibilities, there's actually a third component, our Africa Command. And so if you look at the African coast of the Indian Ocean, that's actually a separate naval command. And so the U.S. actually struggles with 3 different offices. There are some efforts at looking at cross, if you want to say, seam area, cooperative efforts within the U.S. and looking at some partnership arrangements with some of the Gulf states, and this is coastal security with Gulf partners, not necessarily including India. And so that's back to the question at hand is there tends to be a series of bilateral efforts at play.
I just want to add something to that, Hassan. On India-US in the Gulf, there is one opportunity that could take place, which is that uniquely India, the US, and the UK now have privileged access to Duqm Port in the Sultanate of Oman, and this could well be an opportunity to see trilateral or even bilateral exercises take place within the port of Duqm in the coming months and years. And also with the Gulf, all Gulf countries are members of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, as well as, if I'm correct, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and then which the US is either an observer or full member of, and India is a full member of. So in terms of regional security architecture, that really provides an opportunity for US, India, and the Gulf states to engage on the Indian Ocean issues.
There is supposed to be an Indian officer posted as, I don't want to get the technical term wrong, whether he's a liaison officer or a coordination officer or what have you, with the U.S. Fifth Fleet, if I get this right, in Bahrain. Whether he's actually in place yet or not, I don't know, but that's a new initiative in the past year.
So, the gentleman in the third row.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. Ewan Grant, I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst. I did work on a project in Pakistan where I was at the Wagah crossing point 2 days before the suicide bombing. And I cannot exaggerate the validity and seriousness of your points about the tenseness of the relationship. I was really staggered. My question actually follows on from the previous gentleman's point about the Western Indian Ocean and right up to the Suez Canal. How much are the Europeans involved? Because it's not, the US can't do everything, particularly in maintaining political and economic influence in the likes of the Seychelles and Mauritius, where in addition to potential anchorages, there is the real question of countries like China and Russia buying influence through the use of dirty money, which frankly I'm not sure FATF has really looked at. Thank you.
Jack, do you want? I'll take the second question first. Vipul Thakur on the front row, please. On the front row.
IISS member Vipul Thakur. It's just a comment, sir. Mention about India's action in Kashmir across LOC, what Pakistan had done before that. Part of that Pakistan controlled Kashmir was given to China. That was the worst thing. Number two, indigenous Kashmiri population in Pakistan admin area is now in minority because Pakistan has sent in other Muslims to settle there. And three, China-Pakistan economic corridor. It is going through there. India objected. Pakistan ignored it. So Pakistan thinks it can do whatever it wants in Kashmir under its control, but India cannot do it, and that's humbug. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with European involvement in the, I know there are European nations involved in these naval task forces that do provide security for the Western, or certainly the Arabian Sea. I don't know about the Red Sea, and there's certainly been a lot of European involvement in anti-piracy measures off the African coast and at the mouth of the Red Sea and whatnot. But the details, I'm sorry, are not within my, I don't know, Desmond, if you know.
Antoine, do you
On the point about the Seychelles and India has an engagement with the Seychelles as it has with other island states. As I implied, this engagement is growing up. It's in that particular country's case, but also other cases, an engagement made of security and economic components. They vary by country depending on its national circumstances and certainly the incentives which India can bring to that country's table. This is something we're planning to do a lot more work on in the coming months and years. It's important to remember that it's a competitive space, as you indicated. So India is not alone in providing strategic goods, or at least security outcomes for a number of countries. Others are there also. I think what's important is to realize that the demands from those island states particularly are very different from those of some of the littoral countries, and certainly very different from those of major powers. Their focus primarily is on EEZ constabulary roles It's on ensuring they have control of their full maritime domain in regard to non-traditional security threats, drugs, other myriad of issues. But at the same time, the funding and the support comes only with major powers seeing a stake in regard to major power competition. So there is a bit of a dilemma here, and India's approach to those countries is trying to reconcile those approaches in a sensible and sensitive way in regard to India's baggage, it has to be said, in the region, and also the expectations which are set on itself as opposed to those set on other countries which are all deemed to be external to the region, except perhaps for France.
Thanks, Antoine. Next question, Aisha Siddiqa on the front row.
Hi, Aisha Siddiqa from SOAS. I have a question for Jack. Let me take you back to Kashmir and Pakistan and this whole issue of Pakistan clamping down on militants. My question is, the first part of it is that how much do you, in your estimation, does the Kashmir issue at this juncture affect Pakistan's both will and capacity to tackle with militancy? And if so, even if it's on a constant role to kind of clamp down on militancy, is there a methodology viewed in the US about verification of its efforts, and how can it be communicated to India? Is there a methodology at all?
Thank you. We'll also take colleague Ali on the front row.
Thank you, Ali Arsalan Pasha. I'm an intern here at the IISS in the South Asia program. My question is for everyone because you all bring different expertises here. India's Home Minister Amit Shah, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, Minister of External Affairs Jai Shankar have all said that the revocation of Article 370 is only the first step, and soon they will gain jurisdiction of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. For India, this is a huge economic opportunity. They gain opportunity in Afghanistan for a $2.5 billion economic deal just from the start. CPIC can be rearranged accordingly to that. Do you believe from the American, from the Afghan, and even from the Chinese perspective that it is a security concern for these powers, or is it just saber rattling?
Who would like to go?
Sure. In terms of, Aisha, it's great to see you. In terms of your question, yes, there could be an impact, but it's also an opportunity. And I think that there, as far as verification goes, the whereabouts of many of the people, I mean, just some of the prominent individuals are very well known. And if those prominent individuals remain under arrest, and if there's actual legal prosecution against them, not just in some comfortable house under arrest, quote unquote, but actually legally processed, and not just one but multiple, that would serve as a beginning of verification, something that everyone could see, not just internally. And because the history of this sort of thing is not very encouraging, I think sort of long-term, as the U.S. spokespeople continually use irreversible. So it's not, oh, well, we put him away for 2 months, but now he's back out again, making speeches and attracting crowds of thousands, et cetera. I think those would be the kinds of steps that not just the United States, but other members of the international community would like to see. On India and the Pakistani parts of Kashmir, I guess one always looks to state one's, in a negotiating process, not that there is one at the moment, sadly, but in a negotiating process, one states one's desires beyond what is likely to be achieved. So it's very difficult for me to imagine a situation in which these kinds of desires come to fruition, or if I may use the regional term, they will not. It's hard to imagine a situation in which they will fructify.
And I would just add on that your comment about the effect on CPEC and other engagements. Again, if it's more, maybe not necessarily to say saber rattling, but looking at an ideal situation or an extreme bargaining position, of course, the curious question or follow-on question that I would have is how would other investors and actors in CPEC react? And my hunch is they would not react well. That this would almost automatically have a regional impact or consequence, and we would see it expand much beyond a two-party problem. And as well, just a last comment is it's events like this, we talk about Kashmir and others, I sort of make the remark, it sucks the oxygen out of the room, but when we look at investment in Afghanistan, and again, looking at it from the Afghan perspective, the more effort, attention, and finances put into these other dynamics, the less that's in Afghanistan. So the rhetoric will be, yes, we're going to help Afghanistan, but we don't have the resources to do it just yet because we're busy with these other activities. And that's where we stand right now.
I think on FATF, it's hard to understate the stakes for Pakistan. A lot of countries are looking at that moment this week, I think, to gain some kind of, maybe not final, but some critical perspective on what really can Pakistan do for itself, looking forward on counterterrorism. And Pakistan, as much as other countries, has been shaping its fight against terrorism as a progressive, cumulative exercise over a number of years. So there's a lot of expectation which Pakistan has also entertained in that respect, the sense that any progress should not be going back, and that others are expecting to see. We can't prejudge the result of the meeting, but I would be surprised if the multilateral nature of that meeting was not supplemented by bilateral processes which would come in support, or certainly would reinforce some of the nuances which we'll see coming out of that meeting. So what I'm saying is this is a critical moment for Pakistan, but what I'm saying is also this is not the end of the road.
Just a brief word on Indian aspirations in terms of Kashmir as a whole. I would note the resources, particularly I think paramilitary resources that have been piled in to Kashmir at the moment to keep the lid on things. This is, I don't know how sustainable it is, and the numbers haven't been divulged publicly, but people talk about 500,000, which is absolutely vast. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But sustaining that level of military, paramilitary presence is going to be hard work. As it were, on your own side of the line of control, let alone, with wider aspirations elsewhere.
Thank you, Desmond. Our next question is Tim Woolsey, who's in the back. Yeah.
Thanks to all of you. This is a question to Jack Gill. Sorry, you've been getting rather the majority of them, but you mentioned correctly, of course, that every senior official from the United States who's been to Pakistan reads the Riot Act over Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-Mohammed, Haqqani Group, etc., etc. In fact, I could probably add actually not just Obama and Trump administrations, but the second term of Bush Jr. as well, once he discovered that whilst the United States whilst Pakistan was definitely helping on Al-Qaeda, it was doing something rather different on the Taliban and Haqqani.
Yes.
Would you agree that it's United States' sort of repeated failure actually to follow up on any of these threats of action, which has resulted in the reticence that you mentioned in India totally committing to the US relationship, the reticence demonstrated by their views on Russia and Iran and even on China, actually?
Thanks. I'll also take a second question. John Elliott in the second row.
Thanks. John Elliott. I'm a journalist in India for 20 years until last year. In the terms of South Asian security, which is the subject for the event, is India's initiative on 370 regarded as a positive or negative?
Just on on your question, John, the IISS doesn't have an institutional view on this yet, but we're still working to understand the political and the security implications of what happened. But I'll pass this on to my colleague.
Well, I'll take it. It's nice to see you too, again. I think that in direct answer to your question, I think the Indian reticence is driven by other factors before the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is clearly very important. And the history of that very complex relationship is often distorted, both the way it's viewed in India and the way it's viewed in Pakistan. And Americans just forget it, because it happened 3 years ago and 10 years ago and 30 years ago, so in American memory that is practically the time of the pharaohs. So I think that's one aspect, but other dimensions of the U.S.-India relationship are, I think, just as, if not more important to the U.S. as a shadow or a factor to be taken into consideration in the U.S.-Indian relationship. And indeed, the U.S. has actually not just had words, but has taken a lot of actions. And Pakistan is infuriated by the presidential tweet on the 1st of January a year ago. And that resulted then in policy action, but there'd been policy action before that as well that's very direct and consequential insofar as the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is concerned. So there have been concrete things as well as just rhetoric. And I stress the fact that so many that every U.S., as far as I can tell, spokesman has said these things, because I fear that oftentimes in Pakistan that's overlooked. And so I think it's important that it's not just, oh, well, this person said it over in State Department. It's everybody across the government, single, straight message.
John, if your question was about perceptions in South Asia of India's decision on Article 370, I think it's difficult to judge, simply because I think governments have all sorts of competing perspectives and priorities, which really are not necessarily taking a backseat for that single issue. India currently has good relations with a number of governments in its neighborhood. Whether that is, I think, counterbalanced by considerations or any sensitivity to Pakistan's views, I don't know, but my suspicion is that there is not much of a change, I think, from previous positions on Kashmir so much. The reasons for that can be varied. It can be distraction, but it can also be a sense that perhaps doing this as India did was right for a variety of reasons.
Thank you. The final two questions, the gentleman in the third row. Yes.
Hi there. I'm Ben Francis from International Alert. Just a question on the Afghan elections to Dr. Kangas. What effect, if any, do you think the sequencing of the fact that the elections have gone ahead, and if there is a clear result, either this week or at the end of a runoff, what effect, if any, will that have on any potential future intra-Afghan dialogue? Just thinking that originally there was some idea that the sequencing would be the other way around. And so if there is a clear result and therefore representative of the current Afghan government, how does that change that dialogue?
Thank you. And the gentleman on the red tie in the front second row.
Thank you. This is Dr. Tahir, postdoctoral fellow, University of Leicester. My first question is to Mr. Bowen. Regarding, you mentioned PM Khan's speech at United Nations. His focus was not toward the India, but toward the Modi and RSS, his, you can say, association, and how Modi and his fellows, basically they are moving toward their personal or the ideological goals they have set. And as he mentioned that he tried, since he is in power, and but they were not getting such, you can say, positive response from the Modi and his, you can say, the cabinet. And the other question, there is also need to understand that almost 200 million Muslim population, like the minority, they are living in India. So if anything happens in India, not only in Kashmir, so why India is blaming Pakistan like the same rhetoric like the Islamic terrorists or the militant from Pakistan? What about 200 million Muslims living in India? What about them? And there were some, you can say, cases, some evidence that there were some linkage between some Muslim students in India with the IISS during the last few years. And my second question is to Mr. Gill and Dr. Kangas. Can you please also mention the spoilers in case of peace process in Afghanistan? Because Pakistan says that he is happy what is happening in, you can say, between Taliban negotiation with the USA. As if there is a peace in Afghanistan, of course there will be a stability in Pakistan as well. Can you also please mention the spoilers in case of this peace negotiation?
Okay, thank you. We'll go in order here, and this will be your chance for your final
comments.
remarks.
Okay. No, great. And yeah, well, okay, yes, we are. On the issue of the impact of the elections on the inter-Afghan dialogue, and you're right, the sequencing was clearly an issue of debate. My personal opinion is I actually felt that the elections needed to be kept to timetable by the Constitution and by the electoral laws, regardless of the peace process and dialogue issues. Because once you throw that out, any election after that could be called into jeopardy. And we've seen this again previously in Afghanistan. So the fact that they happened, even though twice delayed, good. Now the impact of the election results, and there's going to be several key issues. One, if a second round is required or not. And two, it depends upon who wins. And if we're really looking at the two lead candidates, you could think of a scenario where Ashraf Ghani is declared the winner, absolute winner. Mr. Abdullah questions that, challenges it, and we have a gridlock or stalemate that we did last time around. Don't expect to have a national unity government put into place again. This would have to be carried out and addressed through the legal structure. If the result is the reverse, and by the way, I've heard individuals comment that, of course, their candidate won with an absolute majority or with the 50% plus one. Nobody seems to think that there's going to be a second round, which is intriguing. I find this fascinating. That, of course, if the result is the other direction, we again would have a contest from the government side, and we would have to have this resolved legally. So this would require an extension of any decision, probably going through the end of this calendar year. By the way, in terms of the percentage, that actually doesn't bother me as much as I know it does bother others. The last rounds were in the 30s. I come from a district in the U.S. where unless it's a presidential race, voter turnout could be as low as 15 to 20%. It's incredibly Republican. I think Democrats have most just decide to go to the market that day. But it's not a matter of the percentage, but rather if the election is held, if it was available, and if it's counted properly, that's going to bring legitimacy. And in terms actually of a dialogue, it's going to happen regardless. And I think that's the key point to note. There's going to be this discussion. The formal structures, the U.S. Taliban discussion could easily be restarted. In fact, there's a desire to see this restarted. Again, a pressure to see some resolution here. And it really will depend upon the legal conclusion of the elections and an acceptance by the legal structure and the population in Afghanistan. Just quickly in terms of spoilers, and I had noted these earlier, and I would just simply repeat, a spoiler, the two that I would note right away would either be a serious attack, and yes, it could be a Taliban attack, but we're going to have to throw in the force that we don't tend to discuss much, but Islamic State or Daesh. because I do think that they're becoming a much more engaged actor and in fact are taking defectors from the Taliban as part of their ranks. But secondly, if a decision by an outside power to unilaterally alter its status, whether it's the departure of US troops, whether it's a closure of an Afghan-Pakistani border because of an incident, but some crisis that would suddenly, put attention to that versus these other processes, I think are things we'd have to look at.
I agree. On the spoiler question, I would offer a comment though on India and Daesh. The number of Indians involved in Daesh was very, very small, given the enormous size of the Indian Muslim minority. As you say, it's 200 million, or a little less than 200 million, or several thousand more than. It's a huge population, and the number of Daesh people is very, very small. I mean, I think less than 200. Per capita, other countries are much, much ahead of where India was. And I think the Indian intelligence services have actually done a very good job in identifying people and preventing them from leaving in the first instance. But also, I think the sort of Daesh philosophy has not had the kind of appeal that it's had in some other countries.
Desmond.
Well, you make a comment about Prime Minister Khan's speech rather than to ask a question. I mean, it was a highly political speech, but politicians tend to make political speeches. And part of the object, it seems to me, of the Pakistani position at the moment is to draw attention to the Pakistani perception of what's happening in India and the influence of RSS and the shift in the politics of India. I mean, the thing that's in a way surprising to me is how little traction Prime Minister Khan's speech has or has had, as far as I can judge it, in the sort of wider world. I mean, there seems to be largely acceptance, of the actions that the new government in India has taken, rather than, as it were, a wide international response to it. I mean, there's a sort of silence and quietude which is quite surprising to me as an outside observer. But it seems to me that this is part of the political effort by Pakistan to draw attention to what's happening, and as I indicated in what I said, I mean, the Indians have a intention to sell a completely different story, and to isolate and to some extent, a large extent, ignore, Pakistan, what Pakistani politicians say.
Thank you. We're over time, but in terms of spoilers, any country which in the next year might come with others to make assurances in private or in public that it won't interfere in Afghanistan or won't use Afghan soil to target a third country. If any of those countries come back on their word, that will have a big effect on the overall prospects for peace and stability in Afghanistan, given that very simply there's no one in a position, I think, or in place, no institution to police the compliance with those statements.